So in section 6.6, we're solving rational equations, and I think that it would be helpful to list all of the different steps that you need to follow in order to solve these types of things. So somewhere on this section, if you have some space, like I was able to squeeze it, the top right-hand corner in this little spot here, the notes aren't ideal because there's not a lot of space. So if you wanted to use an entirely different page for this, that's fine. But there's 8 different steps that we need to take in order to solve rational equations. The first thing would be to factor everything if it can be factored. So anything that you see that looks like it should be factored, you should just factor it right off the bat. Sometimes things can't be factored, so then you would just move on to the second step. The second step would be to look and see if the problem is like a fraction equals a fraction. So if it ends up being something like, I don't know, 2 over x squared plus 4 over x or something like that, and it's just a plain fraction equals another plain fraction, it's going to be an easy problem because you can use the cross multiplication method to solve. But most of the time it's not going to be that. This would make it an easier problem, which is funny that that was like the last question we did yesterday. Usually what you're going to have to do is skip number 2 and move to number 3, which is find the LCD. That's the least common denominator of all of the denominators in the problem. There's going to be probably like 3 or 4 denominators, so you have to look at them and figure out what the smallest common multiple is, and then that is what you will multiply every single thing by. So the fourth step would be to multiply everything by the LCD. So if you find that the LCD is x plus 1, then you will multiply everything by x plus 1. But you're just multiplying it by x plus 1 over 1. So you only end up multiplying everything in the numerator by the LCD. The denominators will stay the same. Once you have everything multiplied, then it's time to simplify, and your whole goal is to solve for x. So simplify and solve for x. Just a lot of steps. And sometimes you're not going to do all these steps. I mean, you're not going to do all these steps. These are just kind of like the checklist in order of the things you would look for. Sometimes you'll end right here. You'll be able to simplify the equation because it'll just be like a nice, easy 2-step equation or something like that. You'll be able to get your answer, and then you can move on. But sometimes you'll be left with like a crazy answer with like x squares and things like that. And if you're ever left with something and you realize I can't solve for x, your next step would then be to try and factor it. So step 6, if you can't solve, then you should be able to factor. So I'm going to write if you can't solve, then factor. So like factor whatever you can. And after you factor, what you'll end up with is like x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. You'll factor that to be like x plus 2 times x plus 1 equals 0. You'll use the 0 property that we did earlier in this chapter. And then you'll get 1 or 2 answers or whatever you will get from there after you use the 0 property. And then the last thing that you'll do is check to make sure your answers will actually work. Because in this section, we also will have answers that are considered extraneous solutions that don't work at all. So then we're going to just check for extraneous solutions. Now, you're never going to have to do all 8 of these steps, but these are the order in which you should try and solve the problem. And honestly, this is hard stuff. So, like, for the next quiz, I'm just, like, thinking on the fly. I wouldn't mind if you had, like, a note card with these 8 steps written in order. I think that would be totally fine. So for those of you who don't have this written down, you might want to write it down because maybe I'll let you guys have like a small piece of paper with these 8 steps on there, because this will really help you figure out what you should do to solve these problems. Every single one is different, but if you have these 8 steps in front of you, at least you have a checklist to help you remember what to do next. So I'm going to redo some of these questions, or all of these questions again, but in different orders. So the first question that I did yesterday, I believe was this one right here. So using these 8 steps, the first thing I'm going to do is try and factor everything that I can. So I'm looking at x that can't be factored, 3 can't be factored, 5 can't be factored, 2 can't be factored, nothing can be factored in this one. So I move on to the next step. Look for if it's a plain fraction equals another plain fraction. Because this plus sign is here, that makes it not that. So this is not a situation where we can just cross multiply and solve. So we have to then move to the next thing. The next step would be look for the LCD. So what you're doing here is you're looking, the problem is really x over 3 plus 5x over 2, I don't know why this is working so slow, equals 6. And what we're doing is looking at the denominators. This is just a 1. And we're trying to find the least common denominator of those denominators. And if you can't find the least one, you can always take them and multiply. And that will be one of the common denominators. But you're going to want to try and find the least common one, especially when the denominators are variables and not just numbers, because you're not going to want to multiply by too many things. It'll get too confusing. So the least common multiple of 3 and 2 is 6, which means after I found the least common denominator, I moved on to step 4. I'm going to multiply everything in the numerators by the least common denominator. So I only multiply the numerators because I want to make it 6 times bigger. So I'm basically multiplying everything by 6 over 1. So to do that, I like to use parentheses, and I would like to line up the number I'm multiplying by in the numerator so you can just not lose track that you only multiply the numerators by the number. And then you can turn it into a fraction by putting it over 1 if that's helpful. If not, you don't need to do that. But basically, you're multiplying all numerators by 6, all denominators by 1, which is not going to change any of the values. But the numerators will get 6 times larger. So this is going to be 6x over 3 plus 6 times 5x is 30x over 2 equals 6 times 6 is 36. So we'll have this equation here. Now it's time for step 5. Simplify and try and solve for x. So to simplify this, I can simplify 6x over 3. That's going to be 2x. Plus 30x over 2 is 15x. Sorry, this got messed up. Is equal to 36. And I'm still on step 5, simplifying and solving for x. I can add 2x plus 15x and get 17x. And I can divide 17 from both sides, and I'm going to get that the answer is 36/17. Sorry, I'm trying to squeeze it in here. So that's my final answer. I was able to simplify and solve for x and not have to do step 6 or 7. I didn't have to factor or do anything like that, but then I should do number 8. You should always do number 8 because that's important to check to make sure your answer is true and also to check for extraneous solutions. So looking at the original problem, which was right here, extraneous solutions will only happen if you ever have variables in the denominator, because if you do, then it's possible that you won't have a part of the domain in your answer. Because the denominators are just numbers, 3, 2, 1, there's never going to be a number that will not work for this problem, which means there will not be any extraneous solutions. Extraneous solutions only happen if it's not in the domain. So to check your answer and to check for extraneous solutions, you could basically just take 36/17, put it in for x here, put it in for x here, and make sure when you add these two together, it'll equal 6. So you could easily do that if you have a graphing calculator. If you don't have a graphing calculator, this is not that easy because like putting in a fraction answer is not ideal. on your iPhone. So 36 over 17 divided by 3 plus 5 times 36 over 17, and then divided by 2, it equals 6. So I see that this, when I put it all in, it equals 6. It should equal 6, so I know that I didn't make a mistake. And I also know that there are no extraneous solutions. So that's the kind of run through of the problems. You're never going to do all of the 8 steps. You're going to pick and choose. But this is a good checklist to try and figure out what to do next. So the next one I want to do is the last one on the page. So we're going to move down to the last question on this page. And hopefully you have all of the steps written down because I'm going to refer to them, but they're going to go away once I erase everything. So here is a problem that we're going to solve, and it's 2 over x squared minus x equals 1 over x minus 1. The first step in solving is factor everything. So I'm looking at 2 can't be factored, but x squared minus x, this would be helpful for me to factor it. So to factor x squared minus x, the only thing that comes to mind is pulling out the greatest common factor. What is the greatest common factor between x squared and x? Yeah, so I can take an x out, and I'm left with x minus 1. So I'm going to rewrite this denominator as x times x minus 1, and this is going to be 1 over x minus 1. Okay, I factored everything. Nothing else can be factored. Let's move on to the next step. The next step says look to see if the problem is a plane fraction equals another plane fraction. Meaning it's not like a fraction plus another fraction equals another fraction. And in this case, it is one plane fraction is equal to another plane fraction. So that means I can actually complete step 2, which allows me to solve this a lot easier than the other ones. We don't have to find the least common denominator. We don't have to do any of those steps. To solve this problem, what we will do is cross multiply. Whenever you have a fraction equal to another fraction, to get rid of the fractions, you basically multiply the diagonals. So I can multiply 2 times x minus 1, just make sure you use parentheses. And that will be equal to the other side, which is going to be 1 times x minus 1. And then once I have that, I can then just solve this equation like I would when we solved equations at the beginning of the year. So to simplify this, I would use the distributive property. 2 times x is 2x. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. 1 times x is just x, so it's kind of not really helpful here to have the 1 and the x. If that was a 2, though, you have to multiply 2 times x, and then you'd have to multiply this, whatever that was, times this. So you have to basically do the distributive property kind of like twice. So when I multiply this out, this ends up being 1x times x is x squared minus 1x times negative 1 is negative x. Okay. So now that we have the fractions gone, we can just use algebra to move things around and try and solve for x. So the idea behind this is that you want to combine any like terms that you can. You want to move things all around so that you can solve this equation, but because I see this x squared here, I realize automatically, like I'm not going to be able to just get an answer just by moving things around because I have an x squared and I have an x term and I might also have a constant. So I know that I'm already thinking like it's going to be a little bit longer of a process. It's not going to be just like x equals 4. I won't be able to solve it because I have this x squared and also an x term. So here's what I would do. You have 2 options. You're going to want to try and move everything to one side, and you're going to want to move all of the plane numbers to the other side. That's your goal when solving equations with just x. But whenever you have x squared, you're going to want to basically move all of the terms to the one side, and you want 0 to be on the other side. So you can either move everything to the left or everything to the right. Because I have a positive x squared on the right-hand side, it's going to become a little bit difficult if I move everything to the left. But this is how I showed you yesterday. I'll show you again. To move the x squared to the left, I'm going to subtract both sides by x squared. Then when I do that, I'm going to start my answer here with negative x squared. That's going to be my first term because I think I'm going to have to factor, so you would want that first. Then it's going to be a plus 2x minus 2 is equal to, the only thing left over here is a negative x. Now I want to move the negative x to the left. I'll do that by adding x. So I'm going to add x to both sides and simplify. Negative x squared plus 3x minus 2 is now equal to 0 because these cancel out. Now, at the very beginning of us learning about factoring, we know that it has to be in standard form in order to factor. We also should know that this number can never be negative. So in order for us to make this negative turn into a positive, I basically have to factor out a negative from all three terms. What that does is turns everything into its opposite. So I put a negative outside of parentheses, and I change all of these to be the opposite of what they are right now. This will be a negative, and then inside will be then a positive x squared. This plus 3x will turn into a minus 3x. This minus 2 will turn into a plus 2. Once I factored out that negative, now I can factor this normally. So now we were trying to simplify and solve for x, but we realized that we couldn't solve for x, so we have to try and factor then. So factoring means what multiplies to be 2 and at the same time adds to be a negative 3. Well, the factors of 2 are only 1 and 2, but in order to multiply to be a positive, either both of these numbers are positive or both are negative. Since we have to add to be a negative, that would make both of these factors negative. So I can factor this thing into x minus 1 times x minus 2. Once I have that, it's time for me to move to step 7, which is the 0 property, which means I split up everything and set it equal to 0. You don't have to worry about this negative here. You would just do x minus 1 equals 0 and x minus 2 equals 0. And then you're going to get two answers for x. You're going to get x is equal to 1 and x is equal to 2. Now that I have these two answers, now it's time to move to the last step, which is check for extraneous solutions, which means make sure these answers actually work. So to do that, I would look at the what I have here in green, which is when everything is factored, and use that because it'll be easier than using when it's not factored. So to check, what I would do is 2 over x times x minus 1 equals 1 over x minus 1. One of these answers will not work. Which answer is the extraneous solution? 1. This right here is not going to be a solution. This is extraneous. Because if I replace a 1 in for x in all three places, these two places here and here are going to turn to 0, since 1 minus 1 is 0. 0 times 1 is 0. This will be 2 over 0. This will end up being 1 over 0. It's undefined. 2, though, will work. If I put a 2 in for here, here, and here, then what will happen is I'm going to get the same answer for both. Does that make sense? Okay. So then that means that the only answer for this problem is x equals 2. Your final answer would be x equals 2. On like a quiz, I would say, what is the extraneous solution? What is the answer? So you would be able to figure out what the actual answer is and what would not be. So even though that required a lot of steps, that was considered an easier problem because we didn't have to find the LCD or work on multiplying by the LCD. And what I want you guys to do now before I show you another type of problem is complete a practice problem just like this one. So if we flip over to the next page, the only one that looks just like that one is number 1. Look at the next page of the 4 practice problems here. Which one is the only one that is a fraction equals a fraction? 2. So what I want you guys to do is go ahead and try number 2 because the process will be similar in that you can factor everything you can, then you can cross multiply and solve. In a couple minutes, we'll go over the answer together and then we'll move on to the next type of question. I'll give you another minute and then we'll go over the answers. All right, so I know this stuff is really hard, and I know that everyone's kind of been in a different spot, and I understand and respect that. Like, some of you just need to get through this class so you can get to the next class so that you can graduate, so that you might not already know what you want to do after high school, and it might not require you to take math courses, and that's great. You just have to get through it. Some of you, you are going to need to put in the work right now, because what's going to end up happening is that you'll see SAT questions, and the SAT questions are mainly on like Algebra 2 and geometry. You'll see questions like this, and you're going to want to make sure you get them right so that you get a higher score so you can get into a better university, a better school. And then once you get into school, once you get accepted and you end up picking where you're going to go, they're going to make you take a math placement test. And depending on how you score, that's where they're going to start your math. And depending on what you decide to take as your major, you're going to have to take a certain number of math courses and get a certain number of math credits. Some of them won't matter. Maybe you might only need 9 credits, which is 3 classes. So if you start at a lower one, maybe you end up taking easier classes, and that's fine. But for some of you that want to maybe be anything that has to be underneath of the math, anything that's underneath of math, like science or like engineering or physical therapy maybe, anything that is going to be in the science or math fields, you're going to have to take higher level courses. And if you don't do well in the math placement test, which they're going to ask you questions from Algebra 2, then you're going to have to start at a lower course, and you're going to have to take more classes, which then could affect your graduation year. So just put in the work now is what I'm just saying. I know it's hard, but with practice it should get better. So for number 2, the first step, we should always factor. That's the first thing that I have listed here, but what's kind of funny about this one is when I go to factor the numerator, 2 times x minus 2 over x minus 4 equals 4 times x minus 4, it's actually not very helpful because I have this problem and I can cross multiply. When I go to cross multiply this diagonal here, I'm going to end up having to undo the factoring, which is silly, but usually it will work out in your favor. In this case, it didn't. Doesn't matter, it's just a little bit of extra work. We're going to multiply 2 times x minus 2 times x minus 4, and that's going to be equal to 4 times x minus 4. Okay, so I'm going to have to multiply this by 2, which is what we just undid. So we're going to end up with 2x minus 4 again. And I'm going to have to then multiply this out. So when we multiply a binomial, which is 2 terms, by another binomial, which is 2 terms, you use the method called FOILing. FOIL means first, outer, inner, last. I multiply 2x times x, 2x squared. 2x times negative 4, negative 8x. Negative 4 times x is negative 4x, and negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. That's going to be equal to 4x minus 16 on the other side, since I can just use the regular distributive property for that. Now it's time to move things around, try and solve for x, and if I can't, then I'm going to have to factor. So to try and solve for x, you're going to want to try and move all of the x terms to one side. We can combine some terms here. We have 2x squared minus 8x minus 4x will be minus 12x plus 16 equals 4x minus 16. I'm going to move the 4x over here by subtracting it. I'm left with 2x squared minus 16x, and then plus 16 equals negative 16. All right, so I already realized because I have an x squared, I'm going to have to factor in the end. So in order to factor, you're going to want to take all of the terms, move them to the left, and have 0 equal to the right. So I'll have 2x squared minus 16x. I'm going to add 16 to both sides to move that. And 16 plus 16 is 32. So I'll get 32 going to try and factor it to solve for x. So to factor, this one does not start with 1, but I see that all three of these numbers are even, and I can divide them all by 2. So to make it easier on myself, I'm going to pull out a factor of 2 from everything so that I can factor it the easy way, which is what multiplies to be 16 and adds to be negative 8. If not, you have to do the long way and multiply 2 times 32, then split up the middle term into the two factors that do it, and then factor by grouping. This one ends up working out that I can take the GCF out, and then I can do the factoring the easy way. The factors of 16 are 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. We need to multiply to be a positive, add to be a negative, which means the only way we can do that is if all factors are negative. The two factors that multiply to be positive 16 at the same time add to be negative 8 would be the negative 4s. So I can factor this into x minus 4 times another x minus 4. So it's 2 times x minus 4 times x minus 4 equals 0. These are both the same thing. You're going to get x equals 4 for both of them when you separate them and set them equal to 0. You don't have to worry about the 2. The 2 doesn't have a variable, so it's not used in the 0 property. Only when you have variables will you have to do that. So now we found the solutions. They're both the same exact solution. Now the last thing you would do is check for extraneous solutions, which is almost like do all of this work and then what ends up happening in this problem. There is no solution. Because I take these numbers, which are the same number, I replace them back in the original problem. I'm going to get 2 times 4 minus 4. This is going to be 4 minus 4, which is 0. It's undefined. Equals 4 minus 4, which is 0. Because these end up being undefined here, that means that these solutions, or this solution, these are extraneous. And since there is no other answer, the only answer was 4, that means that there actually is no solution. Because the only answer we found was to be 4, which is actually not an answer at all. So silly, I know, but need it in Algebra 2. Okay, so there are, obviously we only got through like one type. There are still more types of problems that require us to find the LCD. I do have time to go over them with you. We might not have time to practice them, but we are going to now work back at the notes page on this problem here that says equations with one solution. So for these types of problems, you're going to start back at number 1. Factor everything that you can. I cannot factor anything in this problem. 4x, 5, 2, negative 11x, there's nothing to be factored. So now I look to see if one fraction is equal to another fraction. If so, I can cross multiply, but because of this plus sign, I cannot cross multiply, so I move on to number 3. Number 3 is something that we really didn't do since the very first problem today, which is finding the least common denominator. The least common denominator requires you to look at all of the denominators in the problem and find the smallest multiple of all of them. These two share the same denominator, the first and last one, which is x, and then this one is a 2. So what you do to find the least common denominator sometimes is take the different denominators that you have and multiply them. So you have 2 that share an x, so that would just be that those denominators are x, and then one denominator is a 2. So the least common denominator is the product of the two of those. That means the least common denominator is 2x. What you do with the least common denominator in step 3 is multiply everything by it. So when you do that, you're really making it 2x times bigger. So you're multiplying everything by 2x over 1, which really means the denominators stay the same since they will all be multiplied by 1, but the numerators all get multiplied by 2x. So when we do this, 2x times 4 is 8x over, the denominator stays the same since 1 times x is x, plus 2x times 5 is 10x over 1 times 2 is 2 equals, I'm going to make this negative, I'm just going to put it with the 11. Negative 11 times 2x is negative 22x over 1 times x is x. Once we've multiplied everything by the least common denominator, then it's time to try and simplify in your goal to solve for x. So looking at all parts here, let's just try and simplify this. 8x over x, these x's cancel out. So I'm left with just 8 here. 10x over 2, the x does not cancel out, but 10x over 2 can be simplified because I can divide 10x by 2 and 2 by 2. That'll simplify to be 5x. And over here, both of these x's cancel out. I'll be left with negative 22. Now I'm feeling pretty happy because I don't see an x squared. As soon as you see an x squared, you should start to think, I'm going to have to factor this problem to get to my answer. Because we have one plain x, this is something we did in Algebra 1. You solve for x. To solve for x, you do opposite operations, move the a to the other side. I get 5x equals negative 30. I then divide by 5, and I get x equals negative 6. Now that I've solved my answer, you need to just make sure to check that your answer will work. So by checking, that means take the negative 6, put it back into the original problem. 4 over negative 6 plus 5 over 2 equals negative 11 over negative 6. And because these will never equal 0, nothing will equal 0 because we don't have any variables, there will be no extraneous solutions. So to check, you just make sure that 4 over negative 6 plus 5 over 2 is equal to the same number as negative 11 over negative 6. You can do that in your calculator, and you'll be able to verify that it's true, which means the answer is negative 6. We have 3 minutes left, and number 1 on the next page is similar to that, so I think that it would be helpful to try and practice one before we go. So please flip over to the next page again. Number 1 is similar to that one. The first thing that you have to do, factor, nothing can be factored. The next thing that you should do is look to see if it's a fraction equals another fraction. It's not the case. The third thing is find the LCD then. So one of the denominators is x, the other denominator is x plus 1. Here's where it gets confusing. The least common denominator will be the product of the two things. So the least common denominator of this one is x times x plus 1. So what that means for this problem is that you are going to multiply all of the numerators by x times x plus 1, and then cancel things out and try and solve for x. So go ahead and try and take the next couple of minutes to see as far as you can get on this one. We'll probably have to go over the answers tomorrow, though.